Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Matthew Johnson, who is an assistant professor of public policy and economics at Duke University. Through his research, he seeks to understand how regulations, policies, and other institutions shape working conditions in the U.S. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Gill. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I want to start with one of your recent papers, Demand Conditions and Worker Safety, Evidence from Price Shocks in Mining. You say we investigate how demand conditions affect employers' provision of safety, something about which theory is ambivalent. Positive demand shocks relax financial constraints that limit safety investment, but simultaneously raise opportunity cost of increasing safety rather than production. That's sort of an interesting thing. It's a bit counterintuitive, but I can see why employers might do that. When things are really good, they want to essentially produce more and increase profits and cash flows, and sort of put safety in the lower priority. Is that what you're finding?
So that's exactly the idea, and just kind of that trade-off that we outlined in the beginning of that paper. Part of the story is exactly as you said. When the sun is shining, make hay, right? When demand conditions are good, I know that if my firm, pumps out a lot of whatever I'm producing, and we can sell it at a high price, now is the time to produce. And now, whether investing in workplace safety inputs, right, is an inherent trade-off with producing is a question. But some things are, right? So workplace safety, or the occurrence of workplace injuries, is a product of lots of things, but some of them are, do you take time out of the day to inspect your capital equipment, your production line equipment, to make sure it's not defective and it's going to blow up? Do you let your workers take a few hours out of the day to attend a safety training, right? Do you upgrade the goggles and other sort of personal protective equipment you're wearing? These are all things that can limit injuries, but they all come at the expense of short-term production. So when times are really good, it might be much more costly for firms to undertake these kinds of actions that can, in the longer run, improve safety, but at the short run come at the expense of production.
Yeah, and mining is quite interesting. As you know, most commodities have mean reversions in them. And so mining profitability tend to be mean reverting. And so the general tendency might be that when cash flows are high, to delay safety investments on the premise that things are going to sort of slow down in the future.
I think that's right. I mean, yeah, because if you look at kind of, so in this study, we looked at mines that produce globally traded commodities like gold and silver and copper. And if you look at the kind of time path of many of these they tend to exhibit something, not quite a random walk, right, but very idiosyncratic. So if the price is really high this year for whatever idiosyncratic reason, right, like rise in demand for silver in some sort of country, presumably that will not last. So that means that short-term fluctuations could lead to very quick responses for exactly the reason you say.
Yeah.
And I should say, so, and then the other side of that coin, which is what the other part of that sentence from the abstract that you read, is that, sure, right, that makes sense. Firms face like true kind of what we call opportunity costs of some of these safety investments to the extent that they come at the expense of production. But another kind of set of findings that we were, I guess, confronting in this paper is kind of another stream of work that shows that there are a lot of incentives, or excuse me, a lot of investments in safety that firms can make that might truly be valuable for their bottom line, but firms might just lack the financial resources to make those investments, right? Upgrading, various aspects of your production equipment, right, might, like other investments, require some big upfront costs that firms might lack due to imperfect credit markets, other features like that. So, and there's been prior work before us showing that when firms' financial conditions are financial constraints are more binding, injury rates go up, right? Because firms might not be able to make these good investments. So when times are good, right, when I can sell whatever I'm selling at a high price and I can sell a lot of it, the flip side of the story I told about the opportunity cost is when times are good, now I'll be flush with more cash flow as a firm, which means I might be able to make those, valuable safety investments that I was otherwise, constrained from making before. So that's why kind of the theory is ambivalent here that, for the reason I just said, a positive demand shock could reduce injuries by enabling firms to make these investments they otherwise aren't able to.
Yeah. But from the data, do you see, Matt, that managers are maximizing the value of the firm? Because there is in abstract terms, there's a bit of a trade-off, right? So if the safety upgrade is sort of a call option that managers have, sometimes delaying it has value. Obviously, it also has has risk that's added to the firm. Do you see them actually doing this systematically, or this is more of an instinctual gut-based reaction?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. First, when we write down our theory in the paper, we kind of start from the premise that most economic models start with that firm's single objective is to maximize profit. Now, whether that's true in reality and what the objective that the true objective that all managers are seeking to maximize is another question, but we start with that.
Yeah.
And so, for the reasons you said, sometimes delaying these sorts of, even in a world without financial constraints, there could be reasons to, delay a valuable investment in safety for the reasons you just said. So I think all I can really say to that question is, we have really cool data in this paper. We have data on every mine in the U.S. We have every quarter they have to report their injury rates, their number of workers in very detailed categories to the regulator. We observe, right, there's sort of very fine-grained quarterly prices of the good they produce. So again, these are mines producing globally traded commodities. So we merge in all these data sources on all the global prices of these goods. But really, we're just observing these kind of realized outcomes. We don't observe, for example, the amount of money these mines are spending every quarter on different kinds of investments. We didn't, I've done this in other work. We didn't do kind of qualitative interviews with managers for this study. We did with regulators, and I have found in prior work that interviewing managers just about their actions is really valuable. So I think kind of as follow-up work, it would be really interesting to ask managers the questions exactly that you're asking.
Yeah, so So if I understand this correctly, Matt, would it be correct in saying if in the presence of a shock, there is a positive or negative demand shock, the chance of safety upgrades or compliance-related activities decline. In the case of a positive demand shock, it's because of the opportunity cost considerations that you mentioned. In the case of a negative demand shock, perhaps cash flow related constraints. So in either shock, it declines. And so the safety upgrades and regulation compliance is higher in stable regimes. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, let me say back how you were interpreting
Yeah.
it and see if this is in line with what you were saying. So, kind of the main punchline of the framework that we set up is, whatever. Suppose I'm a gold mine producing gold, and suddenly the price of gold shoots up, right? You could say the same thing for, a pizza store that, one day a week, right? The Super Bowl, they have tons of new orders for pizza, whatever. Right. There's two channels, right? The price of what I produce has gone up. The opportunity cost of making safety investments has increased, which means I'm less likely to, have my workers attend to training for safety. That should increase injuries because our safety investments have gone down. On the other hand, things are good, so I have more money. I can make these valuable safety investments, which should have the countervailing effect and make injuries go down. So whether following a positive demand shock, injuries go up or down is an empirical question, depending on which of these two forces dominates, right? Which is relatively larger. So what we find in the paper is when a gold mine, a mine producing gold, sees the price of gold goes up, in the following quarters, its injury rates go up dramatically. I think our estimate is something like, for all of these mines, right? We have we have over a dozen different commodities here. If the price of the commodity a mine produces goes up by 1%, its injury rates increase by 0.14%. So it's it's actually a pretty meaningful amount. And so that says, what that suggests is that this opportunity cost channel is much larger than the financial constraints channel, right? The extent to which a demand shock increases the opportunity cost of these safety investments just outweighs any extent to which it relaxes the financial constraints that allow it to make these safety investments. So a natural question is, does that mean that these financial constraints don't matter? Like, maybe firms aren't really financially constrained. Maybe it's just that, when these demand shocks go up or down, this opportunity cost of safety investments is just changing. And a thing that we do later on in the paper is we try to grapple with, well, are these financial constraints present? There have been papers in the past showing that firms' financial conditions and their constraints do affect safety outcomes. So can we kind of replicate what this prior work has shown? And I'm happy to talk into how we do this, but in the second part of the paper, we isolate a way that changes in commodity prices, the price of what these mines produce, can affect only their cash flow, only their financial constraints, without affecting the opportunity cost. And we find that indeed, when mines' cash flow constraints are relaxed, injury rates go down. It's just that the magnitude is dwarfed by the opportunity cost channel.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so this has regulatory implications, right? If this is a systematic phenomenon that we are observing, so the regulatory compliance activity, if this is true, needs to be increased when there is a positive demand shock.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because another thing that if the regulator only cares about detecting non-compliance with safety regulations. We also find that when a firm faces a positive demand shock, we find that non-compliance with safety regulations also goes up along with realized injuries. So it's true. Certainly a policy implication of this is that if regulators should, increase the intensity of their monitoring efforts to, in industries that are experiencing positive demand shocks. Now, of course, you'd have to consider, I guess, some what we'd call general equilibrium effects there, right? If firms know that regulators are only going to inspect me if I'm in if I'm facing a good economic boom, then when I'm in a bust, I might just completely shirk on safety because I know the regulator's not coming. So you'd have to balance some sort of cat and mouse game there. But I think you're exactly right. There should be something with which regulators should respond to the conditions that might predict more or less violations of their regulations occurring. And you really don't see that. I think in the U.S. at least, you don't see regulators make those sorts of adjustments.
Yeah. So the as you say, if the opportunity cost is the dominant factor, that is the reason they're delaying safety investments. Presumably, they will take up those investments when demand is low, right? I mean, you cannot completely not do it. So, the decision is sort of a delaying decision, not avoidance, right?
Well, in a world without financial constraints, yes.
Yeah.
Where if I know that the stamping the stamping equipment on my production line is old and any day now could short circuit and take out one of my workers' hands, then that's true. That's a question of when I upgrade it, not if. And there's a rich literature in economics of this kind of timing question. So I think you're right. In a world where there's no role of financial constraints, then it kind of changes the implications of how firms would make these decisions. But in a world where firms are truly financial constrained, then there is a question of, it's not just when I make these investments, it's also if.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it goes to the capital structure issue. I mean, it goes to how the firm is managed. So if I have high demand and I increase my dividends, come to bad demand scenario, I don't have any money.
That's interesting.
You might end up with that type of situation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
So I want to jump into another paper. Again, a very recent paper, Regulation by Shaming, you say, Deterrence Effects of Publicizing Violations of Workplace Safety and Health Laws. So in the paper, you say publicizing firms' socially undesirable actions may enhance firms' incentives to avoid such actions. In 2009, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, began issuing press releases about facilities that violated safety and health regulations. So you're arguing here that such a release of information to the public has beneficial effects in terms of firm behavior?
Well, that's the premise that I test in that paper. Exactly. So, yeah. I mean, and the story is pretty simple. If I'm a firm and I know that I could make some investment that's costly to say, take some, result in some outcome that would be socially desirable, right? Make some investment that would, in my case, reduce worker injury rates, improve worker safety. My incentive to make that investment is partly going to depend on the extent to which my stakeholders, my workers, the public, my customers can actually view those investments or view that outcome. If I, and this is kind of like a moral hazard story, if I, go through all this effort to make a costly investment in improving safety or whatever, maybe like sourcing humane ingredients, right? To take a totally other example. But my stakeholders can't observe it, then it might not be worth it for me to make that investment. That's the moral hazard story. So that's in a world of imperfect information. So it's very simply that if these sorts of actions by firms are publicly available, then that eliminates this moral hazard story. And it might make it more raise the incentive for firms to make these actions. So what I do in this paper is test the question of, is one potential inhibiting factor of firms' investments in safety the fact that if they have a really bad injury, it's going to be hard for everyone else to find out. Workers won't find out, the public won't find out. And if you make it easier for the public to find out about really bad injuries, is that going to affect firms' incentives? So that's what I'm testing in this paper.
And so what was the conclusion, Matt? What did you find?
So I found that so okay, well, first let me say what exactly I'm testing here. So what I'm examining in this paper is a policy change at OSHA, right, which is the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the regulatory agency that monitors and enforces compliance with, or it sets standards for safety and health regulations and monitors and enforces compliance with those standards. So, right, so OSHA, along with many other regulatory agencies, for a long time has relied on kind of standard enforcement tools to monitor enforcement, monitor compliance, right? Inspections, audits, like that. In 2009, it kind of ramped up a policy that it had been using kind of in bits and pieces before to really try to publicize its enforcement efforts. So OSHA is an interesting case. OSHA is a very small regulatory agency. So OSHA has like 2,000 inspectors, but it oversees like 8 million workplaces. I think I have those numbers roughly right. So, you know, it's something like if OSHA was going to inspect every workplace it oversees, it would take 100 years or something like that. So, right, so it's very small. So the agency in 2009, in an effort to publicize its sort of enforcement, started issuing these press releases when it issued a really big fine. So the idea was OSHA conducts these inspections. If it finds a workplace out of compliance, it issues fines for each violation it finds. If it issued fines above $40,000, for the most part, the idea was then it would issue a press release detailing what happened. So if OSHA came and inspected, you know, Matt's steel plant and fined me $45,000, it would write a press release about me saying, OSHA just fined Matt's steel plant $45,000 for violations for exposing its workers to safety regulations, or excuse me, to safety hazards. And it would sometimes get pretty detailed. Like, you know, Matt Johnson, the manager, was clearly not invested in the safety and health of his workers. And workers recently suffered, you know, an amputation of an arm. When OSHA inspected Matt's workplace, it found violations of, you know, personal protective equipment, you know, fall hazards, yada, 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 right? Get pretty specific. So, so what I was interested in is when OSHA started writing these press releases detailing these non-compliance issues, how did that affect firms' investments in workplace safety? If firms suddenly knew, you know, because firms before would know, okay, if I'm violating OSHA regulations, I might get inspected. And if I get inspected, I might get fined. And OSHA fines are pretty small. They tend to be in like the median OSHA fine is like $600.
Okay.
But now suddenly, oh wait, if I'm really egregiously violating OSHA regulations and I'm caught, I might get publicized. And OSHA itself called this regulation by shaming, so I might get shamed. Now, right, it's not just I got to pay a paltry OSHA fine. Now, there's going to be this press release that OSHA writes. Very often, OSHA would write these releases and a local newspaper would cover it. Or, you know, if I'm a steel plant, then kind of the steel industry weekly digest, right? If there's like an industry trade press, would also cover and re-release this press release. So suddenly there's much more that can happen. And, you know, in a world of perfect information, this publicity might not matter. If everyone already knew that Matt Steel Plant, was already violating OSHA regulations, then there's a press release about it. Everyone's like, oh, we already knew that. But if suddenly there's this big publicity and everyone finds out, oh, wait a second, Matt's Steel Plant is much more dangerous than we might have realized, then this publicity could get really costly. So there were a couple features of this policy that allowed me to kind of test its effects in a pretty nice way.
It's striking that you say here OSHA would need to conduct 210 additional inspections to achieve the same improvement in compliance as achieved with a single press release. That's a a big effect.
Yeah.
And so what this implies is that OSHA. So do they have a policy of publishing these types of things, or this is sort of ad hoc?
Well, so well, there were features of it that were a little ad hoc, or I guess maybe arbitrary, which actually was nice for me to be able to test its effects. So, I mentioned before that there was this cutoff rule where OSHA said, okay, if we find a company above $40,000, we'll write a press release. The nice thing about that from a statistical sense is OSHA might go and find one company for $40,000 and $4,100. It might go and find another company $39,000. Both those companies have roughly the same amount of non-compliance. They're basically the same, but because one is just over this 40,000 cutoff, it gets one of these press releases and the other one doesn't. So there's this nice, we call quasi-random variation, essentially arbitrary variation in very similar workplaces that do and do not get this publicity. So I'm able to use that variation. And then what I look at is if, company A got just barely was the subject of one of these press releases, right? Had a fine above the cutoff. Company B, another part of the country just barely didn't. What I'm interested in is looking at, well, what happened to the compliance decisions and the subsequent safety outcomes of neighboring workplaces of those two, right? I take company A, right? I said local newspapers would cover these press releases. So it's really local neighbors that would find out. What happened in the months and years that followed, I can follow. How did the compliance outcomes, how did the injury outcomes change in the neighboring facilities of company A compared to the neighboring facilities of company B? That's what I call these spillover effects of press releases. In the crime literature, this is often called general deterrence. And I find these very large spillover effects. So, and they increase with proximity. So one thing, if OSHA writes one of these press releases in the next 3 years or so, there's a reduction in something like 70% of violations of OSHA regulations in neighboring facilities within about 5 miles in the same industry. So very localized. And even if you go further out, if I look at one of these press releases, how does it affect the compliance of workplaces located up to, say, 30 miles away? If I kind of use an expanded ring, a press release leads to about 30% fewer violations of OSHA regulations at these neighboring facilities, up to 3 years later.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back. Matt, we were talking about demand conditions, how that might affect worker safety, perhaps regulators publishing what the firm has done wrong could have some beneficial effects. You have another paper, again, a very recent paper on a different topic entitled The Labor Market Effects of Legal Restrictions on Worker Mobility. You said you analyzed how the legal enforceability of non-compete agreements, NCAs, affects labor markets. You say using newly constructed panel data, we find that higher NCA enforceability diminishes workers' earnings and job mobility, with larger effects among workers most likely to sign NCAs. So NCAs are these things that employees sign in some cases when they take new employment. And it basically says that if they were to leave the firm for a period of time, I would imagine, right, Matt, they cannot actually go to a competing firm or something along those lines?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So exactly. So a non-compete or an NCA is usually a contractual restriction on a worker's ability to move to a different kind of job. So it's typically part of a worker's employment contract. My understanding is most of the time, most non-competes are signed at the inception of employment. It might happen, a worker might get a promotion within their firm, and with the promotion comes signing non-compete. So that can happen too. But right, because they're parts of employment contracts, they can take on all sorts of different forms. But generally, they take on the form of what you said. So there's a stipulation that says for a certain amount of time, so sometimes that amount of time is 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, if the worker leaves, the worker cannot move to a competitor, right? So competitor is, of course, going to depend on the nature of what the firm does. So, if it's a hair salon, the non-compete might say, you cannot go work for another hair salon within a, say, 20-mile radius for a period of 2 years, right? So there's the industry, and there's the nature of competition. So with hair salons, competition is local, right? So there's that 20-mile radius. Say if you're doing software engineering, competition is national. So if you're in software engineering, you might say you can't go work for a software engineering firm for 2 years anywhere in the U.S. I saw a non-compete that Amazon workers had to sign that worked at Amazon warehouses, and they said, if you leave, you cannot go work for a company that competes with Amazon. And good luck finding a firm that doesn't compete with Amazon. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So some of these are very broadly written, somewhat confusing. But at the end of the day, if it's a large firm who have thousands of lawyers on staff, and the employee doesn't have any on staff, it's not a fair situation. So, but if it is enforceable, I guess there aren't a lot of choices for the employee, I would imagine, right?
Yeah. So sure. I mean, and with rare exception, almost any employment contract can include a non-compete, and it could be as broad or as unreasonable as possible in theory. But ultimately, right, at the end of the day, what matters is the extent to which it's enforceable. So, enforceable meaning if an employee violates his or her non-compete. If I work at a hair salon and I leave and I go work at a hair salon next door, my former employer could take me to court for violating it. And then it's a question of whether it'll get enforced in court. So judges are supposed to consider some unified principles, right? Is there a real economic, like a judge considers, is there real economic harm for the worker violating this to the employer? And is there a scope of reasonableness? Now, judges are going to vary in how they interpret this, but a non-compete can't be so unreasonable, right? If there was a non-compete that said the worker can't work for a competitor for the next 20 years, any judge would throw that out. But there's a lot of variability, it turns out, in how judges interpret what is not reasonable and what can't be enforceable. And I could talk about where that comes from.
Yeah, and so the crux of the paper, though, is that the effects of that, right? The effects of an NCA on employees' ability, workers' earnings, and their ability to negotiate. And there are some spillover effects, both within the firm and essentially within the industry, I would imagine, right? In some sense, when you sign something like that, the employee is taking himself or herself away from the pool of available employees. So it has an effect on the overall industry too, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's worth being clear about this, that, non-competes are now, like, federal lawmakers are talking about it. It's over the last few years, it's gotten a decent amount of news coverage. As far as I can understand, before, say, like 4, 5, or 6 years ago, this idea, this national conversation about non-competes was not there. So it was really kind of, historically, non-competes were really, my understanding is, perceived to be reserved for very high level executives, very high skilled workers, right? Like where knowledge creation is really important to the firm's production, right? So software engineers, industries where R&D was really, really pervasive. But we learned 5 or 6 years ago that non-competes are actually encompass much larger share of the labor force than we realized. So hair salons is one where I've done some work, and it turns out is an industry where a large share of workers have to sign these things. There were some very egregious cases, like Jimmy John's was having its fast food sandwich maker sign non-competes. There was a janitor who was making $12 an hour who turned out to sign a non-compete, and he got a job offer at a competitor to pay him $3 more an hour. He went to take it, and then his old company sued him, right, for violating his non-compete. So the realization that these contracts were much more widespread than people realized kind of led to these questioning, like, okay, right, maybe non-competes are protecting these assets for the firms, right, by limiting workers' ability to take trade secrets, take client lists with them. But like maybe there's something else going on. Maybe, this is a way that firms are holding power over their workers, which would not happen in a kind of a perfectly competitive labor market. So that's some backdrop of why people got interested in non-competes. Now, the thing is, because people have only recently become interested in this, we really don't have good systematic data on individual level workers who have signed non-competes. So there's one or two exceptions of this. So there's some work by Evan Starr, who's at University of Maryland, who did a nationally representative survey asking workers if they sign non-competes. I and some of my old work with my co-author Mike Lipsitz did a survey of hair salons asking about it. But really, we don't have any time series data going back several years asking people about non-compete use, let alone over the last 2 decades. So there's a question of non-compete use, and then there's a question of the policies surrounding the extent to which non-competes can be enforceable. So what we do in this paper is we don't have any data on who has signed non-competes, but what we do is we go back about 30 years, and we're able to construct, what we call this panel data set, basically a data set on every year, what was the law in every state determining the extent to which a non-compete would be enforceable. So there's no national law on this. It's all up to the states. This is kind of a vestige of how labor law has been conducted in the U.S. over the last few centuries. And because of things like judicial decisions, some legislative changes, there have been changes within states over time. So when we look at the ultimate thing we do in this paper is we ask, when a state makes non-competes more easily enforceable, when they make it easier for an employer to enforce a non-compete against a worker, what happens to earnings? Now, the effect that we find is going to be a sort of a mix, a combination of, when non-competes are more easily enforceable, what happens to workers who actually sign non-competes, and what happens to these spillover effects, like you said, within industries, within labor markets. And I can go into that. So basically what we find is that when non-competes become more easily enforceable, on average, workers' earnings decline by a meaningful amount. And I can talk about how we kind of decompose the different groups of workers that are affected by these law changes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this, Matt. At the high end, in high technology and biotechnology and so on, there are concerns around intellectual property, and so if the employee is involved in, as you mentioned, research and development and IP development, the firm has an incentive to assure that the employee doesn't leave and basically take all the secrets away. But on the low end, like the hair cutting salons that you talked about, it's a different situation. I also wondered in the low end, in some sense, this feels like collusion between the firms in the sense that suppose NCAs are expected and it has become sort of standard. Then you don't have this problem of employees negotiating for higher pay, right? You kind of lock somebody in, but the competing firms might also welcome that. Because you don't have the pay going up because of employees moving back and forth.
So I think that's a great observation. So a few things. So first, I think you're right that non-competes can, especially if they become kind of a norm, can be a form of implicit collusion. I think that's right. Now there's explicit collusion in the labor market. So along with non-competes, a few years ago, there was a realization that firms were using non-poaching agreements as well, which are very explicitly, right, saying we will not poach each other's workers. So my employer, Duke, it turned out was doing one of these with UNC a few miles away, and the DOJ came after us for it. But also, a lot of fast food companies were doing it, like Burger King franchises. If you formed a Burger King franchise, you had to sign a no-poaching agreement saying you couldn't poach another Burger King franchise's workers. So that was explicit. collusion. Now, non-competes could be doing the same thing. But the thing that's different about non-competes, right, in terms of the labor economics of it, is if I'm a worker and I know that, okay, if I sign one of these agreements, I'm going to lose my bargaining power going forward because, everyone, I'm going to have a non-compete agreement. Everyone around me has non-compete agreements. Then I, might, if the labor market is reasonably competitive, say to my employer, if you want me to sign this thing, you better pay me more, right? Knowing that down the road, my bargaining power is going to be diminished. So for that reason, right, if workers, if there's some sort of choice in the labor market, workers, for that effect, would make workers signing non-competes need to get what we call a compensating differential, like a higher wage up front to compensate them for their loss of bargaining power down the road. So now that's one possibility. Now that presumes that workers know they're signing non-competes, that they have the ability to bargain like that. But so I totally agree with the story you said. But the question, one of the questions that we grapple with is, if it's a reasonably competitive labor market, one might expect that workers would have to get higher wages if they sign these agreements. And so we don't necessarily find evidence of that, but that's one story lurking in the background.
Yeah, I'm being a bit cynical about this. So, suppose in a market, if firm X is not doing well, and its competitor Y is doing well, firm X could have a strategy of denying firm Y good employees by hiring them and then firing them after having signed the NCAs. Do you see anything like that happening?
Well, that's interesting. So that's an interesting thing. So one thing that would limit firms' ability to take such a pernicious strategy like you just laid out is that in most states, a non-compete is only valid if the worker voluntarily leaves.
Okay.
Now in Florida, and I think a few other states, the non-compete is in fact valid if the firm fires the worker. So, maybe in Florida, firms could get away with that kind of strategy like you lay out. But in most cases, it's really about voluntary separations.
So this seems like this is fairly conventional now, right, Matt? I don't know much about it. So a lot of the high-tech firms may have this. In the low-end firms have it, as you say. So this is generally happening in employment agreements.
So the best data that exists on this was the data that I mentioned a few minutes ago by Evan Starr, Norm Bashar, and JJ Prescott, this nationally representative survey. So according to their data, when they ask workers, are you currently bound by a non-compete? So I think I have this right, about 18% of workers, this is in 2014, said that they were currently bound by a non-compete. Now, the problem there is that, I said non-competes are in employment contracts, and employment contracts can be like, 10 pages long, very fine print. So there's very likely a share of workers that have signed a non-compete without realizing it, right? If, I know that when I get these very long contracts, it's initial here, initial there, right? I might not read it too closely. So 18% is almost like a lower bound. So it's probably a little bit higher than that. So, it's not every worker, but if at least 1 in 5 workers are signing these things, it's pretty widespread. And they are more frequently used in high-skilled occupations, like the software engineers, like, R&D, like managers. But, they are used surprisingly often, at the lower end. And one thing I'll say about the hair salons, that's actually a really interesting industry because in terms of the wage distribution, hair salons are on the low end. Like hairstylists, except for the very high-end ones, I think the median yearly compensation in that industry is like $45,000, something like that. And considering the fact that these workers have to go to get occupational licensing, go to cosmetology school, they have a lot of loans to pay too. But that's also an industry where there is real investments made by firms for their workers. So this is an industry where employers train their workers for up to a year, where firms spend a lot of money attracting clients, right, who who then form relationships with the workers. So, the rationale for non-competes, even in parts of the labor market like that, do hold a little bit of appeal in some cases.
Hmm. So, has there been any challenge? I remember reading the paper, Matt. I think you described a situation where certain firms enforce this non-uniformly. So they enforce it for certain employees, but not for others. So they use this sort of a discriminatory vehicle too inside the firm.
So my sense is that's probably true. But the reality is we have very little data on how these things get how firms institute these policies in the real world. So, I said earlier, the example of Jimmy John's, right, who had its minimum wage sandwich maker signing non-competes. The Department of Justice and a few attorneys general went after Jimmy John's, and they said, oh, no, we would never enforce that. We only had those in there because, we use them for our managers, and we just kind of did a boilerplate contract for our workers. Now, sure, that might be true, right? It could be that firms sort of know, okay, we're only going to bother going after a worker who violates this if they're sufficiently valuable to us, or they're sufficiently high in the food chain. But I don't know, it's hard to know. I mean, if I'm a Jimmy John's worker and I had to sign one of these things, sure, I might think my employer might not go after me, but there could still be, what might be called a chilling effect. Like, I still might be worried about considering outside employment opportunities, despite what my employer says. So, I think at the firm level, we don't have a whole lot of information about how these are used. I mean, when I talk to hair salon owners for another project I did in this space, I was talking to these owners who had their workers sign non-competes, and a few of them did say, I just put them in there just because, and I would never actually go and enforce them. But I talked to owners who had very highly publicized cases of very long, drawn-out legal battles with workers. So I think there's both variation across firms in an industry, right? And probably within firms, like you said, there's just not that much information on it.
Yeah, one interesting thing might be also, you say here, we find that higher NCA enforceability diminishes workers' earnings and job mobility. So, it is intuitive to think that over time, the earnings ability of the worker declines because the worker doesn't have much negotiation power. But it would also, since the firm and the employee know that, I would have thought that when the firm asks for the employee to sign an NCA, the earnings will be higher, at least to start with. You don't find that?
Well, so your intuition is exactly right. And another thing that's worth saying is another reason why you might think that signing an NCA would actually raise a worker's earnings is going back to this point that you alluded to a few minutes ago, that one reason firms have workers sign non-competes is to protect valuable assets like IP, trade secrets, client lists, right? And right, there's a rich literature in organizational economics pioneered by Grossman and Hart. Hart being one of the Nobel Prize winners a few years ago, showing that when firms want to make the investments in workers, like investing in IP, investing in attracting clients. If I'm a firm, if I'm a hair salon, for example, right, I could invest a bunch of money in attracting clients. But I know that as soon as I attract clients with my money, those clients are going to form a relationship with my workers. And if my workers can leave and go take the clients with them, then that's going to be devastating to me. So why would I bother making that investment in the first place? But if my workers are signing non-compete, and I know, okay, if I spend this money to attract clients, they'll form the relationships with the workers, but they're going to stay here. So it's worth it for me to make that investment. It's called like the alleviation of an investment holdup problem. So if a non-compete enables firms to make these investments that they wouldn't otherwise, and that can actually raise the salon's productivity, right? Get a lot more clients in, we're all making more money. Me as the firm owner benefits, but workers also benefit too. So that's another reason why workers that sign non-competes could earn more, because that enables the firm to be more productive. So there are those countervailing stories that play, like you said, for workers that sign non-competes. Both they might require a wage compensating differential to compensate them, like you just said. They might get a higher wage because they're more productive, but they could get a lower wage because, you know, maybe workers sign these things without fully internalizing the future costs, and they have lower bargaining power going forward, and you know, they're stuck with that. Now there's two wrinkles to that I want to sort of specify. So one is what we lay out in the paper is that if you make non-competes more easily enforceable, not only is that going to affect the wages of workers that sign non-competes, but it could have spillover effects on other workers, even those that don't sign non-competes. And the reason that we lay out is if many more workers in my labor market have signed a non-compete, that means there's going to be less labor market churn. There's going to be fewer workers moving around. There's going to be fewer firms looking for new vacancies, just because there's more workers locked in place. And when there's less churn, there's less dynamism in the labor market. There's a lot of evidence from prior work that just reduces wages for everyone. It makes it harder for me to find the right job, right? A lot of ways that wages increase are you climb what's called like the job ladder. You like go from job to job until you find the right one. When there's less job dynamism, it's harder for workers to do that. So when more workers sign non-competes, other workers' wages might fall, even though they themselves have not signed a non-compete. So we it's hard for us to test this directly because we don't have the data on non-compete use, but we do a related test where we test for these sorts of spillovers. Basically what we do is you take a local labor market, basically that straddles the state border. You take two counties, one that's in, say, like Missouri and one that's in Illinois, right? That are both in the St. Louis metro area. Missouri makes non-competes more easily enforceable. What we can do is what happens to the wages of worker in Illinois, but are in the county that borders the St. Louis metro area. They're in a local labor market where more workers suddenly have non-competes more easily enforceable. And what we find is that even for the workers in that border county in Illinois, right, that are in the same local labor market as other workers who are now in this new legal regime, when Missouri makes non-competes more enforceable, workers' wages go down in that Illinois county. So there's these further reaching effects of this policy that extend beyond just the workers that signed the non-compete themselves.
Right. Yeah, I mean, on the positive side, though, Matt, I was thinking that, and I don't know if you have any data on this, a firm's willingness to invest into, like you mentioned, invest into training, invest into enhancing human capital in general of its employees is higher if they have, you know, higher confidence employees going to stay. And if NCA is enforced, presumably the firm has higher confidence employees going to stay. So, you know, one thing I was wondering was that do we find that the firms actually are more willing to invest into the employee? So both the firm and the employee in the long run are better off, not just from an earnings perspective, but rather from a skills and productivity perspective. I don't know if that is true or not.
Yeah, so there's been some work on this. So one little bit that I did in this prior work that I said I had done on hair salons. So we did the survey where we asked firms, do you have your workers sign non-competes? And then we asked them a whole bunch of stuff. And we found that firms that had, this firms here is a hair salon, hair salons that had their workers sign non-competes did make more investments in their workers. So they were more likely to offer training. They were more likely to spend real money in attracting clients. Now, you know, that's a correlation. It's, you know, it's you know, you can't draw too much from that, but that's at least the association that I think you're getting at. And there's been other work. There's a recent paper by Jessica Jeffers, who's a professor at University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. She kind of gets at what you're saying. So if non-competes are more easily enforceable, firms might make those investments more likely, and I believe she finds, I might be getting this wrong, I believe she does find that kind of incumbent firms, when non-competes become more enforceable, do make more investments. They do spend more on R&D, the types of investments that are related to workers, the potential for workers to leave and take with them. I don't know if she has training in human capital, but I believe she might as well. So kind of so I think there is some evidence on that. Now, I know in her paper, the trade-off there is that some firms might be more willing to make those investments, which raises productivity and skills for everyone. But another driver of productivity growth is entrepreneurship, right? So firms, or a worker kind of has an idea, creates a spin-off, is an entrepreneur and starts a new business, him or herself. And that's much harder to do when non-competes are around. So, even though some firms might raise their investments in this regime, there's fewer opportunities for entrepreneurship, which actually might lower productivity. So I should say, in some ongoing work, we're trying to look at exactly what you say. When you make this non-competes more easily enforceable, we're going to try to get some data from the Census Bureau to really measure firms' investments, because one thing that I'm really interested in looking at is, are firms benefiting from this? Is what's going on that firms benefit when non-competes become more easily enforceable? And what we're seeing when we see that wages go down, is that kind of a transfer from workers to firms? So that's something that we're going to do going forward, but something I don't have right now.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Matt, my intuition is that the value of non-compete agreements to the employee, my intuition is that it will continue to decline. We are moving into a gig economy. We are moving into an economy that requires flexibility rather than, we don't have jobs where you go work for a firm and 30 years and retire. That thing is gone. And so any situation in which the employee's hands are tied would have higher and higher negative value for the employee over time. So what do you think about that, number one? And number two, if you believe non-compete agreements are good or bad, even either case, how do you design them? What are the features you would say are good to have in an NCA if you think that NCAs are good in general?
Yeah. So your first point is an interesting one, because you're right. I mean, 50 years ago, the kind of stylized fact of the labor market was that workers started working at, General Motors right out of high school and then worked there their entire career. So before, in some ways, there was almost no need for non-compete. So I think what you're raising is a good point, that, if I was a worker 50 years ago that signed a non-compete, I might not care because I'm planning to work at General Motors or wherever my entire career. So I don't care. In some ways, over time, the cost to workers of signing non-competes has gone up because the value of flexibility has increased. But, from the first, this what you raised could partly explain why we've actually been seeing non-competes more and more. Because it could be that 6 years ago, firms just didn't need non-competes. There were maybe more implicit contracts that that workers would stay around. Now that implicit agreement or that implicit contract isn't there, firms need to substitute explicit contract to keep their workers from moving. So you might be right that kind of the benefits to non-competes for firms are growing because their workers are more mobile. The costs are also growing to workers. So how those go in a horse race, I guess, might influence the extent to which we see these being used going forward. So I think that's a really interesting way to put it. On your latter question of, how does the evidence suggest that non-competes should be designed? If you take my research seriously, that non-competes reduce wages, but at the same time, there might be some good things from non-competes. Maybe they get firms to make bigger investments. in some of my prior work, we also found that in some firms, it does seem like everyone benefits from non-competes. I think what is unambiguous is that there just needs to be a bit more hurdles for non-competes to be enforceable, and there should be some more guidelines that firms have to follow if they're going to have their workers sign one. So one idea that's been floated around is, I said non-competes can often be buried in page 9 of the employment contract, which means a worker might sign one of these without realizing it. So, I've seen one proposal that if a firm gets a worker to sign non-compete, it needs to very explicitly make sure the worker sort of sees it up front before they sign one, right? So that's something that I've seen done, right? That seems like a pretty reasonable thing that should absolutely be a requirement. In terms of other aspects of it, so I didn't even mention the various dimensions that courts weigh in deciding if a non-compete is enforceable. One of them is, does the firm have to show consideration, which means, does the firm have to show that the worker received a wage compensation for signing this non-compete agreement? And in fact, that's sort of the dimension of enforceability we find that really is driving this wage effect we see. I think one possibility could be you just make a requirement that firms have to acknowledge somehow that this is costing workers and they need to somehow pay the workers for signing one of these. Because as you said, if the firms are benefiting from this non-compete, that shouldn't be a problem. The firm knows they're going to be more productive by having workers sign non-competes, that it shouldn't hurt them to have to pay the worker a little bit more to sign one. So I think that's that seems like a pretty reasonable stipulation that should happen going forward. Again, that doesn't ban non-competes altogether, but just says it just puts a bit more hurdles for employers to use them in a more discriminate manner.
Yeah, so it sounds to me, Matt, that more explicit requirements. So the employee is saying, I'm going to sign this, but I need to know what the firm is putting on the table. In effect, the employee is given the firm something of value. And there has to be some sort of reciprocal arrangement that the firm will be giving the employee some value, whether it's training, whether it's promise of something, I don't know what it is. So, but I think if I understand you correctly, that has to be sort of spelled out more explicitly rather than, a template type NCA.
I think so. In many ways, what that requirement is doing is setting the stage for what kind of the traditional law and economics discipline believes happen in the contracting, right? Traditional law and economics says, just let the worker and the employer bargain and they'll arrive at whatever's best for the both of them, because it's an efficient contracting idea. But we know that from a lot of evidence that most contractings that happen that way. So you put these requirements on the table exactly as you say, it just sets the stage for workers and employers to maybe bargain over the terms of these agreements in a slightly more equitable manner, right? It's not going to be fully equitable, but at least sets the bargaining table a little more level. And I think that's right, because when I started my work on this stuff, 5 years ago, I might have thought we should just ban non-competes altogether. Talking to firm owners made me realize in some cases these are good. So I don't think the answer is just to ban them altogether. I think it's just to set the stage exactly as you say.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Matt. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thanks for the invitation, Gill. It was really fun to talk to you. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.